Thank you all for joining us this evening. Welcome to Remembrance of Things Past, 1954 to 1965. This is the second webinar in a four-part series. It's entitled, this is part of the Sharing the Origins of the Educational Opportunity Program series, and it will tell the history of the local civil rights movement that had a nationwide impact. I'm Julie Bartolotto, and I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society of Long Beach. We collect, preserve, and present local history. Through historical collections, exhibitions, and programs, we connect people to the past and to the place they live. We strive to present an inclusive community narrative and help create a greater understanding of our neighborhoods, the city, and its place in the larger world. First, I'd like to acknowledge our partners in this endeavor, the Black Student Union Elders Association. Without your research, knowledge, and important work, we wouldn't be here today. And we've been meeting for 2 years, envisioning ways to bring your EOP story to more people. Over that time, we've received funding for the project from the American Rescue Grant with the Institute for Museum and Library Services, California Humanities, the Arts Council for Long Beach, the City of Long Beach, and sponsorship from the Port of Long Beach. I'd like especially to appreciate Dr. Willie Elston, Lawrence Fortenberry, and Cecily Harris Walters for developing this series, and our behind the team scene led by Bianca Moreno, who helped make this program work. Please join us for all of the webinars. In the next one, we explore student activism and leadership at CSULB. We hope you'll join us on June 23rd for Resistance, Resilience, and Reimagination. The final webinar will be held on July 14th, entitled Linking CSULB Campus to the Community. And in February 2023, the Historical Society will host the BSUEA collection that documents the origins of the Educational Opportunity Program. I have a few instructions for the audience members. You're muted and your video is turned off. Please use the Q&A for questions to the panel and for tech support. At the end of today's session, we will pose your questions to the panel. The webinar will provide background on the national political scene that was going on in the lead up to the formation of EOP. Panelists will explore some hinge events from 1954 to 1965 and partially explain the need for EOP. EOP had and continues to have a significant impact opening up higher education, developing generations of leaders from communities who had not been previously represented, and ultimately changing power dynamics in California and the United States as a whole. I look forward to hearing about the history of the era from our panelists who lived the civil rights movement. This evening's discussion is moderated by our historian, Dr. Craig Hendricks, who spent time as a student at CSULB in the late 60s. He lectured in the history department at CSULB, spent the most of his teaching time at Long Beach City College, and upon retirement became even more involved with the Historical Society of Long Beach. I'm proud to turn the presentation over to Dr. Craig Hendricks and our panel.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us. I will introduce two of our panelists tonight, and we'll hear about their experiences that had such a profound influence on their lives. But first, let's begin with a short video of Dr. Joseph White and Dr. Hernandez talking about the importance of EOPS and why in the context of the 1960s, EOP was such an important program because it provided opportunities for students who had been traditionally left out. So let's see that video and then we'll get on with our discussion.
Well, what I observed on campus actually was from 1962 to 1966. was I think we had less than 50 black students. And of those 50, 35 were athletes. So that left about 15 just straight out students. We were not present. And you didn't have to be a mathematician to figure that out. If you had eyes, you could see that. The when the Educational Opportunity Program started at Long Beach was in the fall of 1967. The foundation was, I needed a vehicle to admit the students that I thought had the potential to do college work, but couldn't meet the admission standards. Through this program, I was trying to widen the life opportunities for underserved Black and Chicano students. And I felt America was a land of great opportunity. And I wanted these young people to have the chance to participate in a wider range of opportunities.
So EOP wasn't just some administrative, some little office on campus. It was a place where you went to talk about your future, and he used to ask 3 questions. He says, "Who are you? Where are you going? And how are you going to get there?" Nothing's better than success, and a lot of people have gone through EOP. That had it not been for EOP, they wouldn't be where they are today. So there's an EOP alumni.
So that gives us some indication of why EOP was an important program, a needed program, and why it did a very important job. And so I'm going to introduce our 2 panelists tonight, and then we'll get on with some questions and answers after that. So tonight we have Dr. Alex Norman and Peggy Trotter Dammond Preacely, and they're going to give us a bird's eye view of some of the events, the important events of the 1950s and 1960s. Dr. Alex Norman is Professor Emeritus of Social Welfare at UCLA's Luskin School of Public Affairs, where he taught for 23 years. He is an international scholar of transatlantic policy and a nationally known consultant in organizational development and community organizing. He's also an author. Among his publications is Organizing for Transformational Change, which appeared in 2020. He is currently working on a memoir, My Second Wind. Peggy Trotter Dammond Preacely is a former freedom rider during the 1960s and a working member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. She was arrested and jailed many times for registering Black voters in southern states. Ms. Preacely is a contributing author of Hands on the Freedom Plow, Personal Accounts of Women in SNCC. She worked for more than 2 decades for the Long Beach Department of Health and Human Services and holds a master's degree in public health, Master of Public Health. So we're going to start with Dr. Alex Norman, and then we'll proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Hendricks, for the introduction. I would just like to add, however, that I'm a 2nd generation freeborn African American, because my family, on both sides, my grandparents on my maternal and paternal side were emancipated slaves. Grandpa on my maternal side was born in 1833 or 1834, and Grandma was born 1859. Now, I know little of my paternal grandparents, both of whom were born in South Carolina. And the plantations of South Carolina didn't keep accurate records. As a matter of fact, South Carolina didn't begin to keep records until later in the 1900s. But here is a first slide, which is one of my grandmother, Harriet Spiers, and the marriage license which joined her and Eli together. Now, Eli is not here because he was killed by the KKK after he had beat to death a white insurance salesman who had sexually assaulted my grandmother. My grandfather, after he beat the insurance salesman, went back to his blacksmith shop, and a gunfight ensued with the Klan, and he was shot to death when he ran out of bullets. The story goes, though, that 2 of the Klansmen were also killed. My grandmother and her 3 kids then had to flee to Atlanta, Georgia, to avoid being lynched, because in those days, the Klan would lynch the entire family, leave them hanging in trees for weeks in order to impress upon the slaves how they were not to follow that example. Now, he didn't show up in the 1900 series, but did show up in the 1890 series. And we speculated that the Eli Spiers, who did show up in the 1900 census, who was white and was from the same county, might well have been my great-grandfather. And the reason we believe that is because my grandfather was allowed to develop a trade. He was a metalsmith, and he was the best metalsmith in Lincoln County. And all of the other white metalsmiths wanted him to work for them, and he refused, which probably contributed to his death. The next slide shows you some of the slave quarters, outhouses, cemeteries, lean-to, that were part of the shelter of the slaves during that time. And my grandfather is buried somewhere in that cemetery to the left with the leaning headstones. The next slide shows my mother and my stepfather. My mother was born in 1895. And so she was the one among the first generations to be freeborn. My father, Charles Partridge, and she married 4 years after my father died of a stroke in 1940 at age 44, young man. Now, I'm supposed to talk to you about the foundation of the Equal Opportunity Program, which is the Civil Rights Program. And I'm only going to talk about the EOP, but Dr. White was also left a legacy in a discipline that he changed, psychology. He was a father of Black psychology. But in order to understand the foundation of EOP, we have to go back to 1941, when A. Philip Randolph, here pictured with Walter White of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, promised to postpone the march so that President Roosevelt, who had requested a session with A. Philip Randolph, he promised that he would postpone the March on Washington for Jobs. Because at that time, in the defense industry, they were not hiring Black people, and nor were the armed services desegregated. So A. Philip agreed that if President Roosevelt would prohibit discrimination in the defense industry, he would call off the march. Second part of that was, as we entered the war, Walter White postponed all civil rights actions on a promise that the armed services would be desegregated at the war's end. Now, President Roosevelt was unable to fulfill that because he died while he was in office in 1945, 5 months before the war ended, of a stroke. So it fell upon President Truman, who was formerly the vice president of Roosevelt, to fulfill that promise when he signed an executive order to desegregate the armed services in 1948. Now, the interesting thing is that I was preparing for my last year in high school at the time this was happening. And I came from a very poor family, and we couldn't afford to send me to college. So scholarships were not available for me, even though I was a three-sport athlete and I was graduating in the top 10 in the class. But I had no way of going to college. On the other hand, I had been playing semi-pro baseball. We called it sandlot back then. But I'd been playing semi-pro baseball. We called it semi-pro because they would take up a collection after the game and then divide the money among the players. And during that summer, I batted .371. And that caught the attention of a scout for the St. Louis Browns. And he wanted to sign me to a contract, but I had nowhere to play because they didn't play black players in the Sally League or the Texas League, which were the developmental leagues at that time. And I wasn't good enough to play in the American Association, which was just one step lower from the major leagues. So they suggested that I go into the Air Force and play baseball and sharpen my skills. I spent the next 3.5 years in the Air Force. And you can see from the next slide that I am with my radio operator class, which is the first integrated flight in San Antonio at Lackland Air Base. And the photo to the right of them is when I completed my 9 months of radio operator training and gained my wings. And that's on my first flight. So I also experienced the discrimination when I was in the Air Force. You might call it micro discrimination, a microaggression. I was a honor student. I had a 4.6 out of a possible 5.0 score on my radio operator training curriculum. And as had been the practice, the honor student had an opportunity to stand in review with the Brigadier General Powell on a parade. However, when I got to be the honor student, I wasn't allowed to do that. I was given a detail. So my reward for being a graduate student was to have a detail of men that I could go around the camp and do odd jobs. I did, however, get a chance to play baseball. I played with the Keesler Flyers, and when I was shipped overseas, I played with the Far East Air Force Flyers, but that was short-lived. The Korean War interrupted my days of playing baseball in Tokyo, and I was sent to Suwon, Korea, where off and on I spent the next 9 months in Korea, shuttling between Suwon, Korea, and Nagoya and Komaki, Japan. I did that until I was rotated back to Wright-Patterson Air Base in 1952 to be discharged from the service. And in those days, they allowed you time to be resocialized. So from May to December, I had an opportunity to take courses and become more familiar with civilian life. In 1952, I was discharged from the Air Force and returned to Atlanta to resume my education under the GI Bill. Now, this was not only a boon to me because I would not have been able to attend college, but it also was a boon for the historically Black universities and colleges because it gave them a steady stream of revenue upon which they could depend. And for 4 years, I was financially supported. I attended Morris Brown College. I graduated and was given a scholarship to Atlanta University, from which I also graduated. This was in 1950s. And the 50s were really exciting times because we had just had the Brown Board of Education decision outlawing segregation in our separate but equal schools. But before we could even determine what this meant, because the Supreme Court said that this should occur with all deliberate speed, we didn't know what all deliberate speed was. We found out later that it was do it whenever you want. And if you don't want to do it, that's okay too. So we trying to determine how this was going to work in Atlanta. Emmett Till was murdered brutally in Mississippi, himself a teenager. And his killing was so brutal that his mother insisted that he have an open casket so that people could see just how horrible his face was. He was unrecognizable even by his own mother. So between the good news of the 1954 Supreme Court decision and the bad news of the 1955 murder of Emmett Till, there was still this tremendous resistance all across the South on the ruling. This slide just shows some of the things that we had to contend with, and just to think that it became routine that federal marshals had to escort our children to and from school for their safety. But despite this, civil rights activities pressed on. And in December of 1955, Rosa Parks decided not to give up her seat to a white person on the bus. And the Montgomery Bus Boycott began. Now, that was the largest demonstration of racism that had ever occurred, because the Montgomery Improvement Association refused to ride the buses. Bus segregation was all over the South. And it went on until the next year when the Supreme Court determined that segregation on the buses was unconstitutional. Now, these kinds of situations really began to stir the campuses in the Atlanta University system. And the students began to informally meet and talk about what we could do in order to alleviate the oppression that we were feeling. And get that many of us were older veterans who had gone away, had lived through integrated situations, and knew that there was a better way of living. And so we decided to take it upon ourselves. However, Reverend William Holmes Borders, who was one of the most impressive civil rights ministers in Atlanta, the pastor of Wheat Tree Baptist Church, caught wind of this. And they had just created the Southern Christian Leadership Council in Atlanta in 1957. And so he dissuaded the students from challenging the department stores and challenging bus segregation in favor of the ministers assuming that leadership themselves. And so he and 5 other ministers did in fact challenge the bus segregation. They were arrested, and the filing of a suit in the district court was successful. And in 1959, a federal judge ruled that the ministers had in fact constitutional rights to be integrated in public transportation. I graduated from Atlanta University that same year and accepted a job as a YMCA secretary near a project in Atlanta, Perry Homes Project. And we were basically providing youth services, but under the leadership and the tutelage of Attorney Don Hollowell, I was doing voter registration and voter education. So I did that with people who, for the first time in their lives, had registered to vote. Many of them had never voted. So I did that for a year. And then I moved to Los Angeles in 1960, where I began to work with youth gangs on the streets of East Los Angeles and South Central. I also began to take a number of different jobs, which allowed me some opportunities, such as establishing the first anti-poverty organization in LA County and opening up the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as the deputy supervisor in favor of investigations. And I ended up eventually at UCLA. And there's an EOP connection to my going to UCLA, because the students, among whom was John Oliver, who was a former UCLA student and a former director of the School of Social Work at Department of Social Work at Cal State Long Beach, was one of the leaders of the students in the organizations who demanded that Black faculty come on campus. And so I was hired at the same time that Joe White was being hired at UC Irvine, 1969. He was hired as a professor of psychology and director of the Black Studies program. I was hired as a lecturer in the Graduate School of Social Work and the director of the Department of Urban Affairs. And much of what I did in that department was based on the model that Joe had developed at Cal State Long Beach of recruiting Black and Chicano students, of finding scholarship money for them, of developing a talent search program for getting students who, even though they didn't have the grade point average, could in fact handle university level work. So I stayed there for 23 years, but during my time there, some important things happened. One of them was the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which prohibited discrimination in employment. And the other was the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which in fact made us citizens because up until that time, we were simply emancipated slaves. And as the court ruled in the Dred Scott decision, the Constitution did not apply to us. So Dred Scott had no standing as a citizen. And so therefore, they didn't have to consider him if someone wanted to return him to a slave master. So 64 and 65 were really important because it made the United States of America a democratic republic for the first time, even though we had lofty ideals. So I stayed at UCLA for the balance of the time, and I was able to distinguish myself as an international scholar, as a national consultant. But my real satisfaction came not from the scholarship, but from the organizing that was an integral part of the scholarship. And one, it was a 1990 African Asian Solidarity Conference at the UK, which incidentally included in the American delegation Evelyn Knight and Doris Topsy Eldred, who was just returning from Egypt and decided to join me in the delegation at Liverpool in 1990. And there we developed a manuscript to go to the European Union to demand that there be ethnic and religious recognition when the European Union would, in fact, become a reality in 1992. I also took a lot of satisfaction in co-founding the Centro, Shalom Advanced Organizing Institute. This was with Mark Coleman, Evelyn Knight again, Amelia Nieto, and we graduated 36 students who were well-trained in community organizing and strategic planning to work at the grassroots level. And the third satisfaction came from the Rethinking Greater Long Beach. But my greatest satisfaction really has come from working with the Cambodian people and some of the activities that we developed. So here's one where we developed a forum for the Cambodians to hear in the 6th district, a candidates forum. And from this forum, not only did they get a Cambodian city council person, but as a result of the Cambodian civic engagement activity, they were allowed to rewrite the city charter to get an independent redistricting commission. So now I'm ready to write my memoirs about these experiences because my time in Long Beach gave me a second wind. And that's the title of my memoir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alex Norman. Now we're going to turn to Peggy Trotter Dammond Preacely and for her experiences in the South, same time period.
Thank you, Dr. Norman, for sharing your story and for all the contributions that you've made to our community and to academia. Tonight, I'm going to be sharing remarks about my own experiences and civil rights activism during the 1950s and the 1960s, when I was a youth and a young adult living in Harlem, New York. So if you will bear with me, I'll try to touch on various topics of over 70 years of my life in the brief time we have with us tonight. And I believe my remarks are relevant to the work and the vision of Dr. Joseph White, also, as Alex said, known as the father of Black psychology, because our fight today is not only for voting and civil rights, educational equity, housing and employment, but it is also, in my opinion, an emotional, a psychological, a spiritual, and a moral struggle for America, for us to reckon with its troubled past as we move forward in our society today. As an elder, I always pay tribute to my ancestors who have given me permission to speak with you tonight about our continuing struggle for freedom, equality, and justice. Ashe. In the 1950s, these signs were prevalent all over America, but primarily in the South, also some places in the North. They indicate the state of our country when I was a teenager. We can clearly see the prevalence of white supremacy and legal segregation. There was much resistance and confrontation in communities across the nation. Polarization in our communities, wherever change was taking place. On May 17th, as Dr. Norman indicated, 1954, the United States Supreme Court handed down a landmark ruling under the leadership of NAACP Legal Defense Fund attorney Thurgood Marshall and many others. I remember I was in the 6th grade when this decision was announced. I was sitting in an assembly that was called by my school. But I didn't understand the full implications of it at the time. It was a moral decision, which still stands today, despite setbacks and a climate of continuous struggle for Black equality. My brother and I were specifically recruited and offered scholarships to the prestigious Dalton School in New York City because they wanted to integrate the school with Black children whose parents had had some college education, and because the school administration felt that we and others in the Black community might fit in quote unquote better with wealthy white kids we would encounter in that environment. The academic curriculum was very good, intense, quite superior to the New York City public schools in our Harlem community at the time. My mother's credentials were that she was a graduate of Bates College in Maine, where she had been the first quote unquote colored woman permitted to live in the women's dorms in 1934. And my dad was a 1936 graduate of the University of Pittsburgh, and he paid his way to college by working in the steel mills in that segregated city. My brother and I traveled every day on the bus from Harlem to this all-white neighborhood, and we did what we call code switching in order to manage ourselves in both worlds. That means we altered our vocabulary as well as our street swagger, or how we carried ourselves, depending on if we were uptown or downtown. If any of you have been a minority student or a faculty member in a majority white academic institution or an employee in a majority work environment, you may be well familiar with this strategy because it requires you to find numerous ways, not only to fit in, but also to make sure, as Dr. Norman has described, find credibility for your accomplishments and your ideas among folks who don't want to give you credit or invite your opinions, and certainly don't think you might be knowledgeable about your own history and achievements. So it was often very stressful, something that is prevalent today for many minority students in the EOP programs on campuses these days. This may be less true today than it was in our day, but I'm sure some of you may be able to relate. For my brother and me, navigating both worlds every day was difficult, but it did give us valuable skills to survive in both worlds wherever we went in life. My brother and I are also descendants of two families with a legacy of fighting for freedom and equality for over 100 years. Our great-great-grandparents, on the left in the slide, William and Ellen Craft, escaped slavery in Georgia in 1848, wearing clever disguises. And eventually they fled from America when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850. They went on to live free in England, raised 5 children there, but eventually after the Civil War, instead of staying in England, they returned to the very state of Georgia and founded a school and a farm cooperative for formerly enslaved Black families, not very far at all from where they had once been enslaved. After learning to read and write, they wrote and published their own memoir, their own book, Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, and it was published in 1860. You can see a picture of the original publication there. And they did this while they were living in England. The Crafts' first grandson was my grandfather, and he attended Brown University, graduated from Harvard in 1907, and taught civil engineering very briefly at Tuskegee College under Booker T. Washington. Also on my mother's side was my great-grandfather, James M. Trotter. He was a second lieutenant in the all-Black 55th Regiment out of Massachusetts, and he fought in the Civil War. And the film Glory, that some of you may have seen, is partially based on his story where he tried to find equal pay for the Black troops. And it was his son, my great uncle, William Monroe Trotter, who graduated from Harvard also in the late 1890s. And he founded the Black radical newspaper, the Boston Guardian, in 1901, which was a beacon for equal rights, Black education, and social justice. Uncle Monroe was arrested in 1915 for trying to shut down the theater where the racist film, you can see the poster there, Birth of a Nation, was to be shown. And he and his sister Maud were both arrested and jailed for their activism. My parents named me Peggy Trotter Dammond, and they named my brother Henry Craft Dammond. So I guess fighting for justice and freedom was simply in our blood. I was the same age as Emmett Till. His brutal murder was a turning point in my young life. And so we asked ourselves, if I'm not for myself, then who will be for me? And if I'm only for myself, then what am I? And if not now, when? In those days, the freedom movement had some of us that were still in high school while others of us were in college. We were mostly Black kids, but there were also some white students and a very few Latino brothers and sisters who were in the movement with us. In the 1960s, we dropped out of school. We paused our education, and our parents were worried, not only for our safety, but also that we would lose those hard-won scholarships. But our focus in those days was the wider community, and it was beyond the campus. The Chicano movement on college campuses was also taking place as well. And later on in the 70s and 80s, more campus-based institutional changes led to the Black and Latino studies programs. We often faced violence when we were fighting for our rights. And in order to be in a sit-in, you had to practice to be nonviolent. I didn't go on many dates in the 50s and 60s that didn't involve picketing. Picketing stores in support of the growing nonviolent Southern student sit-in movement. Or I was attending a protest march or a sit-in strategy meeting. Some of the boys I dated later joined me in the movement, I'm pleased to say, like Ron Brown, who became Secretary of Commerce under Bill Clinton. He and I attended the same church in Harlem, and we dated briefly. And Don Harris, who was also later arrested in Georgia for trumped up charges of treason when he fought against white supremacy. The incredible freedom fighting visionary and community leader Bob Moses was also a neighbor, and we were teenagers together in Harlem before we both joined SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We were serious, we were angry, but we were hopeful. And we were followers of both Dr. King as well as Malcolm X. We were able to discern and navigate the distinctions between the two and draw wisdom and direction from both philosophies and ideologies. Stokely and my brother and I were friends and peers in Harlem before we both joined the freedom movement. Activist Ella Baker was also a great influence and a founder of SNCC. Those days, we were finding our way as young people in the South and in the North. It was a heady time. We as students organized without cell phones or social media, and I have no idea where we found the money to travel up and down the East Coast from sit-in to sit-in, from freedom ride to freedom ride, or protest rally to protest rally. We were bold, and we didn't always consider all the consequences of our actions because the immediacy and the needs of the freedom movement predominated everything we did. We were all about the people and not about ourselves. Some of my own peer group didn't understand why I would jeopardize my education, why I would march in the streets or risk getting a police record or being arrested and jailed. But jail for me was a badge of honor. We didn't consider or care very much about long-term consequences, like the FBI file that I finally had and a police record, and how that might impact us later in life. For us, everything was about the movement. So in 1960, I joined SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a group of interracial college students and young people from all over the country, mostly from the South, but others like me were from the North. Author and professor at Spelman College, Howard Zinn, called us and wrote a book entitled The New Abolitionists. To quote him, he said, "For the first time, a major social movement that is shaking the nation to its bones is being led by youngsters, hardened by countless jailings and beatings. who were out of school and living in ramshackle headquarters all over the Deep South. They were striking sparks again and again for that fire of change spreading through the South and searing the whole country. We were on the move. We weren't afraid to make trouble, and we felt we had a moral responsibility to our nation. Some of the students were from white liberal families, and others were from union labor backgrounds and were willing to join the Student Nonviolent Freedom Army. After dropping out of New York's Hunter College in the second semester of my freshman year in the spring of 1961, I became an early freedom rider, testing interstate anti-segregation laws along Route 40 from Washington, D.C. to Maryland with CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. And in December of that same year, I was arrested and jailed for 5 days for sitting in at a segregated restaurant on the racist Eastern Shore in Crisfield, Maryland. From our cells, we sang our freedom songs, and we even heard some of our jailers humming and singing our songs late at night. You know, you never know when and where you're going to find allies if your cause is moral and just. Sometimes the same folks who we protested against later joined our movement. I do believe people can change. The following year, I again put my education on hold when I was recruited by SNCC to be a community organizer and voter registration worker in the deep south of rural Southwest Georgia as a part of the Albany Freedom Movement with other Southern and Northern high school and college students who'd also joined SNCC. I found myself living with sharecroppers, working in the fields, teaching literacy classes in the Black churches at night. And it was all not 100 miles from where my great-great-grandparents, the Crafts, had once been enslaved. It was a profound feeling that I had during that summer. The Klan shot at us and burned our churches down, just like in the 1870s, they had torched the school that the Crafts had created for the new freed Black families in that same area. While I was serving in Georgia, I was arrested twice, and I once spent 2 very long weeks in a rural stockade with dozens of local Black teenagers from Albany. Some were as young as 12 years old, and they had just joined the movement and not even told their parents that they were going on our protest marches. How brave they were. Our church music became movement music, and we created songs that reflected what we were doing in the streets, in the jails, and at the courthouses, registering Black voters. In the freedom movement, we rewrote our Black hymn verses from church, and we created the freedom songs. We changed the Negro spiritual hymn from "Over my head, I see trouble in the air" to "Over my head, I see freedom in the air." And we wrote new songs too, such as "If you miss me from the back of the bus, come on up to the front of the bus. We'll be riding up there." In 1963, I was at the March on Washington. Can you see me there in that crowd? With my SNCC friends, John Lewis, Bob Moses, and so many others. When I returned to the North to begin my sophomore year at Boston University, I once again found myself dropping out of school again to help organize the nation's first freedom school in Roxbury. We were protesting against de facto segregation of the Boston public schools. We taught Black history and social change curriculum. Meanwhile, in 1967 in California, what an important legacy for higher education Dr. White was creating. And the EOP continues throughout our state and in our colleges today. My own college journey took me 34 years to complete. I finally got my master's of public health at Cal State Long Beach when I was 52 years old. So it's never too late to be a lifelong learner. And I've had a wonderful career in public health in various cities, and most recently, almost 20 years with the City of Long Beach Health Department until I retired in 2011. I'm so proud of my grandchildren. Two of my youngest are following in our family footsteps of higher education. So there's always something for you to get involved in right here in Long Beach, like working with high school students or volunteering at our very own Long Beach Freedom School, which operates every summer for youth from 5 to 13 years old. Or you can volunteer at a women's shelter for domestic violence prevention or work on environmental issues. These days, I speak locally and nationally at schools and universities around the country. And as a poet, I perform original spoken word poetry, and I encourage our youth to learn how to express themselves, as well as get involved in the never-ending struggle for social justice and a true democracy for all the people. And I'm so proud of my dear husband, Ernest, who's been a Long Beach community leader for more than 60 years, seen here with Evelyn Knight, who Dr. Norman referenced, two fighters continuing to contribute to our community. Despite the current rise today of white supremacy, of hate crimes, such as the recent murders in Buffalo and Texas and Tulsa, as well as the ongoing suppression of voting rights and equal rights, we will never cease our struggle. This photo represents hope. It's the continued legacy of EOP and Dr. White's vision of access and support for higher education among minority and first-generation students. Thank you, Dr. White. We have much work to be done. You can get involved, you can find a cause, find your passion for positive change, no matter how old or how young you are, or what is your heritage or your status in life. The world needs you, and now. Thank you.
So thank you, both of you, Alex and Peggy, for wonderful presentations. It strikes me, hearing these presentations, how interwoven all of the histories of the last 50 or 60 years are that produce the kind of changes we've seen. And you can sort of draw a direct line from World War II through the 1950s to Dr. Joe White, and how this all comes together to produce the kind of changes we've seen. But also strikes me that both Alex and Peggy were eyewitnesses and active participants in one of the truly great social and political movements in the history of the United States. The massive changes that the Civil Rights era unleashed on our national culture are still being felt and measured 7 decades later. They and their fellow activists faced danger, tremendous obstacles, studied indifference from many, many political and social leaders, yet they pressed on. Despite all these problems of violence, lack of support, and local resistance to change. They sought nothing less than the total change of a system of discrimination that had lasted for nearly 4 centuries in the United States. Their hard-won successes can never be allowed to fade from memory. That's why I'm so happy to be participating in this webinar. Will be preserved for people to see this in the future, and they can hopefully understand not only the crisis and the fear people went through, but also the great successes and the pride that people took in unleashing the kind of changes we've seen in our society. And we're going to take some questions, and we'll do that a little bit later. But first, I have a question for both of you. You can answer any way you wish. But as you looked back through the years, the 1950s and 1960s, there seems to be, at least to me, perhaps, a generational difference between the younger people and the older people. Did you also feel that? Was there resistance to change for older people in your own communities?
Peggy?
Alex, go ahead.
Are you saying then or now?
Then, yes, then.
Then?
Yeah, then.
Then. Absolutely. one of the wonderful things that happened when Dr. King came to Albany, Georgia to help the Albany, Georgia Freedom Movement was that there was disagreement between those of us that were younger, the students, and SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Dr. King wanted to continue protest marches, and it was the philosophy of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to let the people lead, to allow the people that we were registering to vote. Ella Baker, incredible community organizer, always told us, people know what to do. They know what they need. And they knew that they needed to register. They just did not need to protest march. So even though there was the younger folks, and I have to remember that Dr. King died when he was only 39 years old. So when I knew him, I was 19, but he seemed older at the time, but he really wasn't. But some of the older people in the community were afraid of what we were doing. And so they wanted us to hold back. However, we didn't air our dirty laundry in front of everybody. We had secret meetings between the students and Dr. King and the community. And we came up with strategies where both aspects of social change could move forward, because a lot of change happens behind the scenes, like the people that bailed us out of jail, the lawyers and so on. So you always need several generations, I think, of people who are in established positions to help with things like bailing out of jail, because we weren't lawyers, we were just kids. So that was then. Today, I don't see the same tension between older and generations, maybe because I'm older now and I don't want to think that I'm out of touch. But I think there's because of social media too, and the fact that we can see so much and that we can communicate seamlessly with each other. Alex and I are both in our 80s and we're able to do this Zoom stuff just like our grandchildren. So I don't feel that it's the same. I don't know what you think, Alex.
Well, of course, I think it's a generational thing that's endemic to culture, that the younger people are more radical, more aggressive, more assertive than the old people. In Atlanta, we call them the old guard. And as Peggy was saying, in 1957, when we wanted to go down to Rich's department store and picket, and Dr. Borders and Dr. King, King's father, and they came and said to us, look, we know better how to do this. We were incensed, but we had been conditioned to respect our elders, even if our elders were wrong, to respect them. And as it turned out, it was okay, because later on the students in Atlanta did in fact develop the student movement. SNCC was very active. Morehouse, Spelman, Morris-Brown, and College, all those students. And so there was a lot of pent up emotion. And I think it's because the older people were fearful for us that we would be hurt. I mean, you saw the ferocious attacks on the children that Bull Connor and all that group in the South, I mean, they were malicious. And the older people knew this. And we were hell bent on getting the changes. So we didn't really care. I mean, we weren't that interested in we were going to get hurt. We didn't think we were bulletproof, but we thought that it was our time. And I think that even now, I see elements of that. I see some portions of that in the Black Lives Matter movement. That some of the young people feel that we didn't quite pushed the needle as far as it should have gone. And so now it's their time. But, you know, older people can give context to a situation.
Yeah.
So I give context to our progress. And when I look back, we have advanced tremendously. Now, make no mistake about it. There's a tremendous way to go, but we have progressed. And the fact that my generation, which I call the civil rights generation, produced the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1969 Public Accommodations Act. I mean, we did a lot by legislation, but that was because the country would move on the awareness. And so we would use the media to make the country aware of just how oppressed we were. And that would galvanize allies to our cause. I think that now young people are much less tolerant of the pace, and they want freedom now, but without understanding that this system was designed to resist change. So I think that at the same time that there is a feeling of our time has come, I think that eventually young people will see that there is a contribution that the older generation can make, not in telling them how to do it, but to give some context to what they're doing so that they act much more strategically rather than tactically.
Yeah, indeed. And we should also point out here that no less than 3 dozen civil rights workers, black and white, were murdered in the South in just 3 years of civil activities. Very dangerous. The Klan was very, very dangerous.
Yeah.
People paid the price for that. So that's they had good cause to worry about that in regard.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And of course, change is always difficult. Nothing tells a story about the need for change as front page pictures on every newspaper in the United States of young children teenagers being hit with fire hoses in Birmingham and places like that, and police dogs being sicked on unarmed civilians. That really was a powerful story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember, and I learned this living in the South because I had never lived back in the woods where some of the community had to learn how to defend itself against the segregationists and the night riders. So those of us that were living and invited into the homes where we were working with the voter registration campaign and teaching literacy, we were nonviolent. But I lived with a woman named Mama Dolly Raines, who herself was a sharecropper and a midwife. And she told us, y'all can be nonviolent, but I'm sleeping with my rifle across my knees on my porch so that I can defend you all if somebody comes up in here. Mm-hmm. So the contrast between us agreeing to be nonviolent and working on social change through voter registration and so on, many of the people who didn't make the front lines were able to defend their homes. And I have to respect that because I could always go back to New York. I could always leave. And many of us did, especially after the 1964 Freedom Summer, where Goodman, Cheney, and Swerner were murdered even before the Freedom Summer started. And I was aware of that. But the people where the change was taking place, they had to remain in their community. They had to negotiate. They lost their jobs, they lost their homes, they lost their farms. So they had a lot more at risk than we did as students that were coming through there.
Indeed, yeah. We have a question from Teresa Marino. Thank you, Dr. Norman and Peggy. I'm so honored and humbled to be your colleague and friend in the current movements and the 1970 Chicano and EOP programs. I taught EOP classes at LBCC in 1985 with Phyllis Arias. How do you feel about the white backlash and voter suppression happening in the US now? Do you see us fighting these injustices? Either one of them can answer this.
You know, there's always been backlash. I mean, that again, giving context to it, the proclamation that freed the enslaved people, the Reconstruction period was a backlash to that. The Ku Klux Klans, the Knights of Columbus, that was the backlash. The 100 years of peonage, that was the backlash. The Monroe Doctrine, that was the backlash. There's always this resistance. And what we were taught was we had to plan for that resistance. So we had to think strategically. We think about the progress, but what's going to be the backlash? The white supremacy that we see now is the backlash for the Obama administration, 2 administrations. And the white people are saying we can't allow brown and black people to run this country that we stole from the Native American through genocide,
Right.
and built the economy on the blacks of enslaved Africans, and the railroad on the Chinese, and taking Texas from the Mexicans. I mean, they see the power for manifest destiny slipping away.
Mhm.
And so, sure, there will be backlash, but we'll get through it. We always have. We will get through it. And it may very well be that getting through this one won't be on the backs of black people, but it'll be on the backs of all people. Because I think what we're seeing now is that the threat to a democratic Republican form of government
Yes.
is not just a threat to black people or to Democrats or to liberals. It's a threat to everybody. So yes, I think we'll get through it, but I think we have to expect the backlash and we have to deal with it. We have to defend ourselves, as Peggy said, because at the same time, we can't get into a shooting war. So we can't try to match firepower with firepower because we don't have the firepower. What we have to do is defend ourselves in different ways. I don't know how, but it will come.
Peggy, would you like to comment?
I really support everything Alex has said, and I would only add that I feel our democracy is in peril. And I believe, as Alex said, that is not just for people of color, but for all of us. So everyone has a stake in rescuing America from this direction in which it's heading.
Thank you. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Can we hear more about the Long Beach Freedom School? Can anyone in high school attend?
I can answer that. It is a program that is funded by, oh my goodness, I'm trying to remember the name of the freedom schools are all over the country. They're in churches, they're in schools that are closed for the summer. And it is a program primarily for youth whose families may not be able to afford summer programs for them because it is free. It only goes up to age 13. It's for 5-year-olds to 13-year-olds. It started out, as I mentioned, in 1963 and 64 and spread across the nation. But you can get in touch with the Long Beach Freedom School, and the owners of it and the directors are Dr. Leon Wood and his wife Paula Wood, and perhaps one of the follow-ups to this webinar can give you information for it. It is not for high school students, but college students who go through a training program. They actually go to Tennessee, to Alex Haley's location there, where they are trained to be servant leaders. And as a college student, you can get paid to be a teacher. So it's usually less than 100 students for Long Beach, but there may be one in Lakewood. There's one at my church in LA, which is Holman United Methodist Church. And if you Google freedom schools in LA County. You might find one that is looking for people to be a teacher. Books are given to the school by Barnes and Noble and all kinds of places that want to donate. It really, when we were about it in Boston, it was about de facto segregation. It is also about literacy, helping kids to learn how to read. And one of the wonderful things about the Long Beach Freedom School is that it teaches young people how to be social activists and do something in their community. And every year that they have it, they pick a different subject. For example, one of the subjects was, how do you help the elderly in your community? Or do you know how legislation is developed? So it's both in class as well as field trips. It's a wonderful program, and I'm sure they're always looking for volunteers.
Thank you. We have several comments to the effect of amazing presentations. Thank you so much. Marlene McCurtis says, so wonderful to hear these inspiring stories of courage and continued dedication to the struggle. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions? I'm only seeing these four. I guess not. Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Did you want to say something, Peggy?
Oh, I just saw a question. Would I please share how my great-great-grandparents escaped slavery? Yes. My great-great-grandmother was the child of her master, and her mother was his slave. So she was biracial, and she looked so much like her white master that the wife of the master found people mistaking her for one of their children.
Yes.
So she was a house slave, but she could pass as white. She was able to have a liaison, not a full marriage, with a young slave in the community who was a cabinet maker. And together they concocted a masterful disguise where she passed as a white male planter by dressing up, and he passed as her slave. And they made it all the way from Macon, Georgia to Philadelphia on to Boston. So their story is one of courage and of imagination. And it was a love story because they made it to freedom on Christmas Eve in Philadelphia. And their story, it can be, it's a public story, it's public domain, and people can purchase their book on Amazon or from small booksellers. And it's a story that I feel is important because two people they self-liberated themselves. They did not travel on the Underground Railroad. And if we talk about self-liberation, it really starts with the self, no matter what your circumstances are. So if you're a domestic violence victim, you can find a way out if you engage yourself in a belief and in the strength. And so as I examine more and more about what my ancestors did without having the ability to learn to read and write, when you were asking earlier, Craig, or someone was saying, what kind of, I guess it was Teresa was saying, what kind of courage is needed? There's always an avenue for courage in your life. You just have to find it. So I gain strength every day from my ancestors and what they did.
And I'd just like to add, because Peggy said that her great-great-grandmother looked like the children of the family, and the mistress of the family was often mistaking her for children. That's no accident.
Nope.
What happened was that during, I think it was 1796, when slavery, when the transatlantic slave trade was curtailed, there still was a need for labor on the plantations. And the breeding farms. There were breeding farms. There were actually farms where they bred Black people like animals to work in the fields. And the fact that she said that she had a place in the house indicated that that was status, like my grandfather, who was allowed to develop a trade. I mean, he was named Eli Spiers, but the supervisor of the plantation was also Eli Spiers. And as in those days, I mean, that was a common occurrence for white men to take advantage of Black women, all the way up into my high school days. And I would hear people talk about, well, I got my sweet Georgia Brown. White men talking about they got their sweet Georgia Brown. I knew what that meant, you know. I came home and I asked my mother, and she said, well, they don't know what they're talking about, but I knew what they were talking about, you know. So the whole idea of Thomas Jefferson, for example, he put his own children out in the fields so I mean, the framer of the Constitution, we think we lionize people, but remember, 18 of those people had slaves, and Washington didn't even emancipate his slaves, took them all the way to his death. So that feeling of power and dominance is what drives white supremacy, and it's embedded in our systems. And as much as there's resistance to critical race theory, there is no question but that racism is embedded in all of our systems. And that's not to denigrate the systems, it's just to admit that it's there. And if we really want to do something about it, we have to either get rid of those systems or modify those systems or change those systems or do something or substitute those systems. That you cannot, if you keep doing, as Dorothy Height said, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you always got, you know? So we can't continue to try to improve a system that in of itself was not designed for people like me.
And, you know, some of my ancestors, the Trotters, we're descended from Jefferson's Monticello plantation. I am not a descendant of Jefferson and Sally Hemings, but I am a descendant of Sally Hemings' sister, Mary Hemings Bell. Yeah. And what is happening on the at Jefferson's Monticello today has been a resurgence of an attempt to reconcile the history of the real plantation and the real Jefferson world. And we call it the Getting Word Project, because there were individuals who built the house, the beautiful mansion that Jefferson may have designed, but slaves built all of that. And so if you visit there today, you will find a dialogue and an openness and an attempt to reconcile, never completely, because Jefferson wrote, you know, the Constitution saying all men were created equal, but yet he had slaves. So there's never going to be a complete reconciliation, but I do admire what some of the people who are in the leadership capacities at Monticello are doing. And I will be speaking there in June and going with some of my family there, because we are a part of that new conversation.
And it took historians a long, long time to come to grips with this. Remember when Fawn Brodie wrote the original Jefferson book, she was basically kicked out of the historical profession.
Yeah.
And so it's, you know, it's another indication of progress that, you know, historians have been writing, especially the last 20 years, about these kinds of issues, what's called the internal slave trade, and what that led to. We have another question from Evelyn Knight. How do we develop a strategy for all of Long Beach to get the attention and resources that the high income areas get?
Dr. Norman.
Well, you know me, you know, I think it all begins with organizing. You know, Peggy talked about self-liberation. We have to liberate ourselves. Nina Simone said, freedom to me means no fear. You know, we have to have no fear. And when you have no fear, you do what is natural, not what you're guarded in doing, not what you're afraid of doing, but what is natural. And I think it is natural that power never concedes. It never has, it never will. So if those who are marginalized wish to develop resources, then we have to organize. It is very difficult to organize, but it's very satisfying to organize. You know, one of the things that the greatest satisfaction I have in the 22 years I lived in Long Beach was working with Laura Som, who was a Cambodian Advanced Organizing Institute graduate, the only Cambodian in the program that we had. And she developed a center called May Center because she was kidnapped when she was 4 years old and taken to the jungles, and she was adopted when she was 8 years old by a farm couple, and they taught her meditation and agriculture and yoga as a way of healing the trauma that she had as a child. And so she developed this idea that you could convert trauma into activism. And so she developed this center, May, meditation, agriculture, yoga, and education. Education of trauma, of what it does and its forms and what you can do about it. Now, Cambodians in Long Beach have no power, none whatsoever. They're at the bottom of the totem pole. And yet, the people who were involved in the trauma education classes and the programs there, the women, most of the women, 12 women and 2 men, they not only healed themselves through the program, because we organized around PTSD and depression, but they saw a need for helping others. And in helping others, it increased their own esteem. So helping others was a healing a portion. And not only did they help others, but they gave others the incentive to help others. And it was like a rippling effect. What happened was they were broken into 4 districts in the 2011 redistricting in Long Beach. Even though Long Beach said it would not do that, it went against its own principle and broke them into 4 districts, 1, 2, 4, and 6.
Shocked.
And when they decided that we want to do something about that, these women went on a campaign in which they got over 3,000 signatures to present to the council. And the mayor listened, and he enlisted this group of women and men and us as advisors, Mark Coleman and I, to help rewrite the charter so that that kind of gerrymandering would not occur anymore. Now, that's what you can do with people who have no power. Imagine what you could do with a collaboration of marginalized groups who, as Evelyn says, want to get what the high income areas have. But it will take some organizing. It will take some risks. And where there is no risk, there is no reward.
Well, thank you very much. We're almost out of time. I'd like to, first of all, invite all of our audience to our next webinar, which will be June 23rd. And that topic will be resistance, resilience, and reimagination. I'd like to finish up tonight by a short video, very short video, just a few seconds, in which Dr. White has something to tell us.
What should a university look like in this day and time? I say it should look like America, the university, from top to bottom, faculty, students, curriculum, administrators, role of the university in the community. You should not have to walk through a university in this day and time and ask where are the blacks and the Chicanos at every level, faculty, student body curriculum and so on.
Very good, very good. So Alex, Peggy, thank you very much. Wonderful presentations. And we learned a lot tonight.
Thank you for inviting me.
Honored to be here.
These are some further resources that are available. You can go on the website. Historical Society of Long Beach has this on our website. So if you'd like to take a look at some of these resources. Okay, very good. Well, that was terrific. I really enjoyed that.
Wow.
Yeah, really good job.
It just, it reminds me so much of how the struggle is really interwoven. I mean, there aren't really segments. It is just one continuous struggle that morphs from one form into another form, producing yet another form, morphing into yet another form, with all its complexities and difficulties. And yet the progress continues. So I'm really encouraged. I hope that the people who participated in this are not only informed, but encouraged that something can be done to further the cause of social justice, but that we have to do it together. We can't do it individually.
That's pretty clear. Recent history really gives us that indication.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Always be forces that want to divide us.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Lincoln who said, "A nation divided cannot stand." And that's true. It will not stand. But yet, the dumbing down of America really has put us in a bind, because now we have people who can't understand what the hell a democracy is supposed to be, that it's supposed to be messy, it's supposed to be slow, it's supposed to be frustrating, and they want quick answers. And that's not what democracy is. But we threw civics out of the course.
Yes.
So I'm glad that Freedom Schools is bringing it back.
Yeah. Are we still on?
Yes.
Oh,
We are? We're still on with our public?
I don't know. Julie, what's the status? I thought we were done, huh?
We're still on.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
Would you like to continue, or would you like us to stop?
well, somebody said, I talked of his generation as a forgotten one.
Yeah.
Is that a way that we can boost these remembrances in a respectful way? It's up to us.
Mhm.
It's up to us and the forgotten generation to remind people of who we are and who we were. So, because so many of us were assassinated. Medgar Evers, Whitney Young, MLK. I mean, somebody else needs to write about us, but we need to do it ourselves too. And the unfortunate thing is that we were so busy opening doors for everybody else, we forgot about us, And I think it sometimes it's that way, that one generation sacrifices itself for the next generation. So I think our legacy is in the next generation that follows, not in whether or not the country remembers who we were. We played a critical role. We fought a forgotten war called the Korean War. We were a forgotten generation. We were between the World War II and the Vietnam generation. They don't even mention the Korean War. It's almost as if we weren't there.
Yeah,
So I think that we can, some of us who are still around, I'll see my 91st birthday in July, and I'm still writing.
I'm coming to your party.
I hope I'm coming to the party. Yes.
Okay. You know,
But I think that's my rant. I just think that we have to do something ourselves. We can't wait for other people to do it.
I wanted to respond to that in a way by saying that what we learned as community organizers, we can share. And I was thinking about an experience that Teresa and those of us in the Long Beach, Ron Arias, those of us in the public health department had in the 90s here in Long Beach, when the Asian gangs and the Mexican gangs were killing each other. And we found something that was a common enemy to both of them, and got them to talk and learn each other's history and why the color red was important to both the Mexican and the Cambodian gangs. And out of that, I forget the name of the gang unit, I forget who it was, but it was profound because they ended up really helping each other to get out of poverty once they stopped killing each other. So my religion, I guess you would say, besides being a Christian, is community organizing, like you're saying, Alex. And that is where I think the journey that we were on, the paths that we were on, can be shared with others, just as long as we have the energy to get out of our homes, get out of our little personal spaces, get dirty, you know, get shouted at, maybe. That's okay, you know, because everybody's not going to agree. Like you say, democracy is messy. But I think that they want to know, how did you do it and what can we apply to our social issues today? And I see that happening. I see that happening intergenerationally, and I see that happening interethnically, and I see that happening in many of the initiatives that are happening in Long Beach. The commission, what's the name of the Ethics Commission or something that the Long Beach, I don't remember all the names, but you know, there's movement, and some of the movement is not always on the front pages. You know, it's not always about a march. Some things happen neighbor to neighbor, door to door, situation to situation. And that's where I think what we did can be helpful today.
Well, you know, I guess I like to back up a bit and say, it's my responsibility to make sure that we were not forgotten. And I think that's one of the reasons that I come late to writing books, that I'm documenting the life, you know, so that there'll be a record there for people, you know, to read. I thought that was important to do that for the Cambodian community, because they didn't have the scholars to do the documentation in time that needed to be done. So I took it upon myself. If not now, when? If not me, whom? Huh? So I had to take it upon myself, because the responsibility is all of our responsibility. Anytime you see social injustice, you have to respond to it. And an injustice had occurred. And so I thought it was necessary for me to write about what happened to the Cambodians in Long Beach, so that Long Beach would not forget that it had propagated an injustice against people that needed to be corrected, and how it was corrected. So time is getting away for me. You know, the balance of most of my life I have lived. I've lived well, and I've loved well, been loved well. So I have no complaints. I've accomplished everything that I ever wanted to accomplish. I've got icing on the cake. So I feel that all I have to do now, I'm obligated to give forward. And I'd like to just, because it's not forced upon me, but it's an obligation. But it does remind me, and I'd like to end this with just the poem that Dr. Benjamin Mays wrote for Dr. Martin Luther King's funeral, his eulogy. And it was called, I've Only Got a Minute. It's a short poem, so I won't hold you long. I only have a minute, 60 seconds in it. Forced upon me, I did not choose it. I know I must use it, suffer if I lose it, account for if I abuse it. It's only a tiny minute, but eternity is in it. And I think that we have to use our minutes wisely. And the minute that I have left, I think I should be using to document the everyday life and experiences that I've had that contributed to helping people become better. And that's my ending rant.